right, so we are going to kick off the program and we are going to start. All right, so thanks again, everyone. All right, so my name is Lenny Wright, and I am your host tonight, and I'm a volunteer with the 5F Ministries. Now, to share a bit about 5F Ministries, we were founded and have been in operation since 2018. We're a Bible-based, believing and practicing Christian ministry, and we are concerned about the things that God is concerned about. And for this very reason, we have partnered with Love of Hearts Foundation Incorporated and the Free Network to raise awareness about this worldwide issue that we know as human trafficking. Now, we know you may also have questions while the speaker is presenting, so we ask you to type them in the chat and or hold them until the Q&A section. So without further delay, I now invite Lisa Hart, the founder and president of Love of Hearts Foundation Incorporated, to introduce our speaker for tonight. Lisa, over to you.
All right, thank you, Lenny. Good night, everyone. As Lenny said, my name is Lisa Hart, and tonight I get the pleasure of introducing my friend, my career mentor, Dr. Sharita Ernewein. So Dr. Ernewein is a board-certified family nurse practitioner in the United States. She specializes in pediatrics, but she's overall family practice. Dr. Ernewein holds a doctorate in nursing, and she also holds her Ph.D. in nursing as well. She is currently an assistant professor at the University of Tampa. That's a university in Tampa, Florida here. She's the president of the Tampa Bay Advanced Practice Nurse Council. She's also the director of the Region 3 of the Board of Nursing, right? The Family Board and Advanced Board of Nursing, I think. She has over 30-year experience in the nursing profession and has about 20 years of working with the vulnerable population, which is abused women, crisis center. She's also a volunteer or works with the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay, where she examined sexual assault victims. She works closely in the community with professional organizations and community resources in regards to vulnerable population and human trafficking. She gives back to the community on a whole. She loves to be involved and help those who are in need. And, you know, she's very knowledgeable in the field of nursing and has expertise on across the board about human trafficking and vulnerable population. So I present to you tonight, Dr. Sharita Ernewein. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I just want to confirm that you guys can hear me okay.
Loud and clear.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And then confirm that you guys can see that okay.
Yes, we are.
Perfect. So I want to start by thanking you guys for inviting me here tonight. I am very happy to be able to share my knowledge and my expertise on human trafficking. And it gave me an opportunity to look into some of the statistics and information specific to Jamaica. So thank you very much for inviting me. I also invited some of my students. So if any of my students are here, make sure you send me a message letting me know that you were here so that I can give you the appropriate credit. And thank you for coming to learn more about human trafficking. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right in. So once again, Lisa gave me a great introduction and told you how I'm involved in the community with human trafficking. So today we're going to learn more about human trafficking in your community. So this is more of like a human trafficking 101 as we get some of the basics on human trafficking. It's going to be a little bit more because we are going to specifically focus on some things that are happening in Jamaica, some of the things we can do to help combat human trafficking in Jamaica. The Free Network is one of the organizations that I volunteer for. As Lisa said, I actually go out in the community, provide multiple education opportunities in regards to awareness, hitting and targeting healthcare providers and just other community organizations, just to increase awareness on human trafficking, because with awareness, that's going to be our first step in being able to combat the problem. And then just stating that I do not have any commercial disclosures. I'm here as a volunteer to share my knowledge with you guys, answer any questions that you may have at the end, and then to be a support in regards to human trafficking. So just a little bit of background information. As you hear me talk about human trafficking, I'm going to target human sex trafficking, labor trafficking, and different population groups in regards to human trafficking. But I want to start by telling you what human trafficking is. So as we look at this definition, and then I'll break it down even more, human trafficking, and this was by the Trafficking Victims and Protection Act, and it was first defined in 2000, the year 2000, and it was a global definition in regards to what human trafficking is. So we start by just addressing the definition as human trafficking being the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons. So this is all done by forcing people or using fraud or coercion. So kind of convincing them to do something that they would not normally have done. They do it to obtain some type of exploitation. So these people are exploited through labor or commercial sex acts. And then it's where there's a profit. It's at the expense of adults and children. It's compelling them to perform labor or engage in commercial sex. So what I like to do is spend a few moments kind of breaking what human trafficking is. When I look at human trafficking beyond that basic definition, I look at it as a well-hidden human rights violation. And I say well-hidden because for most of us, it's happening right in front of us and we fail to see it. So some of the things that we think is, maybe this person is doing it because they want to, or maybe this is just part of what they do, or maybe that kid is bad. Well, sometimes and many times that's not what's going on. So it's hidden right in front of us. It's based in exploitation. It pretty much can happen to anybody, but the vulnerable people are being targeted. And what do I mean by vulnerable? It's basically people who are, the lower socioeconomic level. They don't have as much money. Their education is not as high. And we'll talk about what vulnerable populations look like. But overall, human trafficking is happening to over 50 million people worldwide. So this problem's not limited to Jamaica. It's not limited to the United States. It's a global problem. And I also want to say that Jamaica is a source, a transit, and a destination country. That means that they're providing people to be trafficked. They're a place where people are trafficked through to go to other locations. And it's a place where people are brought to be trafficked. So Jamaica is all around a full source for human trafficking. Human trafficking is a $150 billion industry. So it's profitable. That's why we're going to have a problem with stopping it. The product is people, our people that can be used over and over again. So when we think about drugs, drugs are, used and done. We look at guns, okay, done. With people, this person can be used over and over again. And I'm talking 1, 5, 10, 20 times in a night, and really reinforcing that it can happen to anyone. So it's important to talk about some of the myths of human trafficking, and I only targeted a few. When we look at women and girls are victims of survivors of sex trafficking, it's not only women and girls, it's boys, it's men, it's LGBTQ community. Pretty much anybody can be a victim of human trafficking. So we have to open our eyes and our mind into what a victim looks like. Human trafficking involves the movement, travel, or transport of people across the state or nations. It does not have to. It can be happening right in their own backyard, right in someone's own house. They can be trafficked. So you don't need to leave your home, the country, the state to be trafficked. And traffickers target victims they don't know. Believe it or not, the majority of people are trafficked by someone known to them. Many times it's family members or someone that they trust. So really wanted to, kind of debunk some of the myths that we may have about human trafficking itself. So to reinforce what human trafficking is, it's a business. It's a business where people's freedom, a person's freedom, is stolen for profit. It's a billion-dollar industry. When we look at the traffickers, these traffickers are lying. They basically are getting vulnerable people to come with them, to do something with them with hopes of a better life. They trick them, they defraud them, and they force them. And with the victims are lied to. They're assaulted, they're threatened, and they're manipulated, all through promises of work or debt bondage, through social media or forced marriage, even through friendships. So really opening our eyes already in regards to what is human trafficking, what does this look like? So when we look at who are the victims, and there's another slide down, further down that we're going to talk about, but it's vulnerable populations. We're talking Jamaican women and men. We're talking Jamaican girls and boys. We're talking children. So keeping that in the back of our brain as we talk about victims and what they look like. So what's the root cause of human trafficking? Even though this is a billion-dollar industry, the root cause is the demand. It's that person on the other end looking for someone or something. So that demand is what's going to help us. If we can figure out how to remove the demand, that's when we can figure out how to eradicate or decrease human trafficking. But where can we start? We can start like we're doing today with awareness trainings, reinforcing, thank you guys for being here, with education, looking at public policy and laws. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the policies specific to Jamaica. Know that they have been called out a bit and they've stepped up, but we're still far behind in regards to what we can do in human trafficking. So the scope and global impact. So when we look at in Jamaica, for instance, we have the National Task Force, and that's a Trafficking in Persons Task Force. It was established in the year 2005. It was a multi-agency approach by the government of Jamaica to strengthen the legislative, institutional, and operational capacity to combat trafficking in persons. And that was all based on, initially, there was Shared Hope International, who put out report cards. And with report cards, Jamaica had a pretty bad report card. They were identified as a tier 2. And a tier 2 meant that they weren't doing a whole lot to help protect their community from human trafficking. So then in 2013, there's a TIP, a TIP, Trafficking in Persons Secretariat, that was set up, and they work under law enforcement, looking at forensics, border security, defense and protective security division. All of that is part of the division, shall I say, and the Ministry of National Security. Its goal is to mandate, to coordinate, to support, and facilitate and monitor implementations of plans to combat human trafficking. So they do have a plan in place. It's focused on combating human trafficking and reducing and eliminating human trafficking in Jamaica. It's just that it's not doing as much as it should and can do. So that's where your knowledge is going to be able to help. So a little bit more on the scope of human trafficking. It's over 50 million people trafficked worldwide. Majority of it, believe it or not, is forced labor. So human trafficking is a worldwide problem. It's not just Jamaica. It's not just the United States. It's worldwide. And we talked about it being highly profitable because the victims can be used over and over again. Majority are women and girls. 4.5 million are sexually exploited, with 25% being children. So as we look at those staggering statistics, we understand how it became a problem. Now we have to look at how do we eradicate that. So who's at risk? We talked just a little bit about vulnerable populations. So who do we identify as vulnerable? People who have problems with drug abuse, people who come from poor households because they're more apt, more at risk for giving away or selling their child. Unstable housing or homelessness is definitely putting people at risk. Persons with mental health concerns or recently located. People who've had a history of sexual or physical abuse, and then the LGBTQ community. So when we look at people, let's focus just for a moment on the LGBTQ community. The children, they've been persecuted, and bullied. in the community as well as their homes. So they're basically trying to get away from these conditions. And when they're trying to get away, they're putting themselves at risk, or they're highly at risk, sex trafficking. When we look at children from rural Jamaica and some other Caribbean countries, may be sent to live with affluent family members or acquaintances somewhere. These are kids, family members that become exploited or, forced into labor, like private households, markets, or shops. So remember, it's not just sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking also. And then look at young people in state care. They are highly vulnerable to trafficking also, particularly as they age out of the welfare system. So now they fall into that homelessness or have problems with substance use or a history of sexual or physical abuse. So that's helping to increase or create vulnerability. So who are the victims? Male and females, adult and children, foreign-born nationals, as well as US citizens, because people come over to Jamaica and get trafficked or come over to partake in the trafficking. Persons with lower socioeconomic levels are at risk for trafficking, as well as educational levels, the ones with lower ones. Then we look at people being preyed upon are ones with disabilities and mental health disorders. One of the things I want to say is that many children are reported missing in Jamaica. The traffickers exploit some of these children and force them into labor and sex trafficking. So what does that trafficking victim look like? Pretty much anybody, guys. So I just found this picture of anyone enjoying the day. Pretty much anybody can be a victim. They can look like you or me. They're persons that I know who are well-to-do that are or have been trafficked. So that victim can pretty much look like anyone. So we've talked a little bit about victim of human trafficking and what human trafficking is. Now we're wondering who engages in human trafficking. Pretty much, once again, anyone. So residents of Jamaica's poverty-stricken areas effectively controlled by criminal dons, migrant workers, workers in informal sectors, particularly places like family farms, markets, and shops. But what these traffickers do is they target those kids. They target the adults who look like they need something. They subject the children and adults to forced begging, and the women and children to domestic servitude. When we look at girls, sometimes they're coerced by family members. It's been normalized. We've seen other family members do it. So they may be subject to sex trafficking by men who provide money to the family or material payment to the girls and their families in exchange for sex acts. So we look at, these types of child sex trafficking and recognizing that it's widespread in some communities. So we also look at families, the parents. They're more frequently facilitating their children being exploited, especially since the pandemic. This exploitation is making home life even more difficult and unsafe for the kids. So they end up running away or becoming homeless, and then once again, still in that vulnerable position of being trafficked. So it's increasingly unsafe for children, especially those from lower socioeconomic groups. So as we, revisit what I said, it's organizations, yes, organized crimes, or small mom and pop groups that are targeting people. It's family members also. It's the gangs, yes, the forced kidnapping, alcohol and drugs. But then there's also that person who just loves that vulnerable person. They said they love them. They're going to give them some great gifts and they give them false promises. And what becomes a dream becomes a nightmare. When we look specifically at the gang members, they exploit children, especially boys from disadvantaged backgrounds. We look at forced begging, maybe forced into criminal activity, things like being a lookout for some crime or armed gunmen. Look at, ways that they have been forced into this criminal activity, but we look at the government and the protection for the kids. They may say, okay, they've been trafficked and protect them to some degree. They don't protect them from the other criminal activity they've been coerced in. So big problem in regards to some of the survivors. I use this image in regards to what the trafficker look like, as they can look like anybody. It doesn't have to look like just you or just the terrible person. They're people that look like someone you could trust for all ethnicities. So pretty much anyone can be a trafficker. So as we look at trafficking, human trafficking, it's a public health emergency. What we're seeing today is that it's affecting not just that person who's being trafficked, it's affecting the family and the community. Some communities have stigma associated with it, so that if that person was to get out of that trafficking situation, they still can't return home based on the stigma or false views of what trafficking is. And then just touch for a moment on the health outcomes. If you think about someone who's in the unsafe working conditions, working long hours, be it labor trafficking or sex trafficking, they're going to have negative health outcomes. They're going to be sick. They're going to suffer from diseases, STIs, or pregnancies. So this trafficking negatively impacts their health outcomes. And then we look at the cost to society as we look for social services that are most definitely needed, and the judicial system that is needed to help combat it. Judicial system that needs education on the victim, being a victim versus a criminal. So all of those things tied into making human trafficking a global threat. So if I talked about human trafficking, I'm saying, about 16 million in forced labor, over 50 million trafficked. Why can't we find these people? Part of it is because we're not aware, reinforcing that's why we're here today. So now a lot of times we walk away and we look at things from a different light. We look at people as being undocumented or runaways or homeless. We can't find them or we can't see them because they're just that youth that's standing on the corner, but recognizing that that trafficker is preying on those marginalized groups. So they are very difficult to identify. And you'll also find that many of them can identify as a victim. So where does human trafficking happen? It's on the streets. So now as you step out and look around, look on the streets. Look at the nightclubs and the bars, the massage parlors and the hotels, the private homes as well as resorts. The private homes are hard because we can't see what's going on, but the other places are pretty visible. So now it's time for us to look and see. So children are subjected to sex trafficking in Jamaica's resort areas frequented by tourists. Sometimes the parents are involved in selling the children. And once again, I want to reinforce, this is not just a problem in Jamaica. Even in the United States, there was a recent sting. And with that sting, the police officers, law enforcement posed as the child, or they posed as the parents selling the child. So the people who were ready to buy this child knew they were talking to the parents selling a child or that they were talking to a child. So recognize, reinforcing that this is a problem that we have to look at, and it's not just focused on Jamaica. These are just some of the industries: the massage, the health and beauty, escort service, and we're identifying as pornography as a major contributor to it because it's normalizing things that used to be normal. So if we look at how do we eliminate some of the need for pornography, that may help also in regards to the demand. So the types of trafficking in Jamaica, same as most places: commercial sexual exploitation, the commercial sexual exploitation of children. And then we look at the labor trafficking, be it services, domestic, agriculture, and street vendors. So there's two general categories, but we all know that organ trafficking is indeed a problem throughout the world. We're just not focusing on that today. So what is commercial sexual exploitation? It's human trafficking. So if you ever see that, the CSE, you're like, okay, that's still human trafficking. And that's the involvement of any person over the age of 18 who don't have a choice when participating in sex acts. It's not new, but reinforcing that it thrives on the sale of people. Some of the things that we've known it as, and now we're changing our thinking, was prostitution. Is that person really wanting to be a prostitute, or is someone making them a prostitute? We're looking at the commercial production of pornography. It's contributing and a part of human trafficking. Online transmission of live video of sexual activity for anything for exchange of anything in value. That's considered human trafficking. So let's move to the next slide when we look at the child aspect of it. Commercial sexual exploitation for children, basically anyone under the age of 18, and they're involved in the areas of the commercial sex industry. It's not new. We're still familiar with it. We have to make sure that we don't normalize it. So it's the prostitution of children. It's online transmission of live video of a child engaged in sexual activity. And then when we look at it, even when we look at some people who may choose or think they've chosen the field of commercial sex industry, we have to stop and think, did that woman or man as a child think, I want to grow up and be a sex worker? I want to grow up and be a prostitute? Probably not. So we have to look at what led to some of those things. What led to that child wanting to be in that field if they think that this is what they chose at that point. And the problem continues. So technology, our favorite friend, and also one of our biggest nightmares, technology and social media. Because now the traffickers are luring the young victims, pretending to be someone else on the other side of that tablet, pretending to be another child or teenager on the other side of that phone or video game console. This trafficker is typically communicating one-on-one using technology. So if they're in a room or a group, they're going to ask that child, do something else. Let's meet one-on-one. Let's meet in another chat room. And in that room, victims are enticed and trapped, pulled out of that comfortable environment that they may have been in and sold. So we're looking at how do we protect our child from social media and technology. And when I say child, it happens to adults also. So trafficking has increased even during a pandemic, guys. Online recruitment increased significantly, and I know you're familiar with Facebook, 125% increase, Instagram, 95% increased. Jamaica women have reported a high recruitment, in regards to these online technologies. They've been charged high recruitment fees. They were misled about terms of employment. They were compelled through threats to continue working in different places, to include the United States in the hospitality industry. So just so that you know, the government mobilized, the Jamaican government, it did mobilize social workers and youth workers to do a door-to-door effort to help identify and locate and re-engage some of the students during that pandemic or after that pandemic, because they wanted to engage and find ones who were unaccounted for. Still, as of December 2022, over 3,000 students remained unaccounted for, and that placed them at a high risk of being trafficked. So that ties into them being recruited in their hometown and in home. I definitely want to tie into labor trafficking and recognize that it's a modern day slavery also. It's illegal smuggling, and it's done for the purpose of forced labor, bonded labor, and involuntary child labor. Same thing as we've been talking about, guys. It's the lies, threats, the violence, and the coercion. And it's in many different industries. Labor trafficking can be within the United States. It can be out of the United States. Jamaica has loose laws in regards to labor, especially with children. And with those loose laws, that's setting up that platform for exploitation. So laws against trafficking, you're thinking, okay, if this is a crime, where are the laws? What are the laws against trafficking? That takes me back to that Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was actually initiated in the year 2000 and pretty much reauthorized every couple years. And overall, its whole goal is to be able to identify human trafficking, recognize it as a crime, then be able to protect the victims from being treated as criminals. So getting them back into the community. So with Jamaica, the government criminalized sex trafficking and labor trafficking through its Trafficking in Persons. Remember how we initially talked about that? So they have that Trafficking in Persons Act. It's the Prevention, Suppression, and Punishment. Basically, what it says is the law is saying that there's penalties for up to 20 years imprisonment for offenses that involves adult victims, and up to 30 years of imprisonment for those involving child victims. So we're like, okay, so we have laws in place, so why is this still so huge? Laws aren't being followed appropriately. So yes, the government increased law enforcement efforts, but we still have problems. These are just some statistics specific to Jamaica in 2023, and that's that Trafficking in Persons report. So out of all the trafficking that we said, and we talked about how human trafficking is hidden, out of all the trafficking we've talked about and numbers we didn't touch on, only 60 cases were investigated. 55 were sex trafficking and 5 were labor trafficking. Only 7 suspects were prosecuted. 5 for sex crimes, 2 for labor crimes, and only 1 suspect, 1 sex trafficker was convicted, and 2 traffickers were convicted for labor. Therein lies our problem. So Jamaica law protected trafficking victims from prosecution for immigration or commercial sex offenses committed solely as a result of being trafficked. Remember how I said it did not provide immunity for other unlawful acts committed. So guess who's getting arrested? Guess who's going to jail? Pretty much the victim. I want to touch on children and trafficking a little bit more because that's how we can start getting this education out. Reinforcing children and trafficking. It's happening globally in the United States. We're talking about homelessness, runaways, foster cares, malls, bus stops, pretty much anywhere where that vulnerable child, the ones with their head down, the one who looks like they have a need, are being targeted. We talked about how they're being trafficked and who they're being trafficked by: family, friends, intimate partners, as well as strangers. This is done through violence, threats, at bondage, and the persons are being manipulated. We talked about some of the risk factors, the home environment, and a history of abuse. And then the trauma, guys, physical and psychological trauma. It's not just this moment in time, it's ongoing for the rest of their lives. They struggle with who they are, they struggle with their self-identity. And then, as I said before, how can we help? Through awareness, and then competency. Competency in recognizing that something's going on, something's wrong, identifying that that's potentially a problem, and referring appropriately. So as I start with the children, or just kind of home in on the children, I home in with these children because these children these children are now the adults that you may be talking to or seeing or noticing. At one point, they were the children that were being trafficked. So that takes me to adverse childhood experiences. Let's take a moment and talk about ACEs. When we look at adverse childhood experiences, that's that physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, or domestic violence. It's pretty much any of the things you see listed here that's increasing that child's risk for further victimization, creating that vulnerability. So I look at adverse childhood experiences as potentially traumatic events that happen in childhood. It includes that abuse, neglect, and the family dysfunction. It impacts children and youth's mental and physical health. It crosses all genders. It crosses all age groups and all socioeconomic levels. But reinforcing that these ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences, have short-term and long-term physical and psychological impacts or consequences. So the more ACEs they have, so if I have just one, like say physical abuse, then yes, I may potentially have some problems, but the more I have, the higher my potential is for being a victim, for having vulnerabilities and having problems. So 1, okay, 3, even higher, 6, extreme. So increased number of ACEs, like the child in foster care, the child in the welfare system, a child who was in the welfare system who's now on the streets. So poverty or near poverty, twice is likely to have 3 or more ACEs. And those are, once again, adverse childhood experiences. So stepping away from just Jamaica statistics, but throughout the world, approximately 41% of child trafficking experiences are facilitated by family members or caregivers. Makes it hard and unique to identify that child. Makes it hard for that child to identify that they are a victim because they've seen this every day. This is their norm. So many who are trafficked do not realize that they are trafficking victims. I've had victims that I've spoken with who were trafficked from as young as they can remember, stating that the youngest thing that they can remember is being in pornography or their family taking pictures with them or being sold to someone. The exploitation from that age on is normalized. The traumatic impact is severe, and we still have few resources to be able to help with that level of trauma that the person's been exposed to. So this is the person who's an adult in that sex industry who doesn't realize that this is not something that everyone does. So how does that person get in that situation? We already talked about how some of it's been normalized right in home. Other ways that this person is being forced or controlled is through coercion, right? They're kept under guard. They're forced into humiliating situations. They may be forced to use drugs, or they may be denied the use of drugs. So we get them in a compromising situation, and I kind of talked about that a little bit with some of what's happening in your community. The boys, they're being made to still or be part of criminal activities. So we have them in this compromising situation, exposed to drugs, confined. Now we're using threats to keep them in the situation. This person has seen someone else being beaten to within an inch of their life, or someone else who tried to get away being threatened, or their family members being threatened, their siblings are being threatened. That's how they're being kept in that situation. And then, yes, there is a kidnapping, the gang rapes, and the torture that the person is enduring that keeps them under control. Statistically, these are the top 5 forms of forced fraud and coercion, and it's not specific to one area. It's overall in general for human trafficking. When we're looking at sex trafficking, that person's being induced or exploited with substance use issues, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the intimidation and threats that we mentioned, as well as emotional abuse. It may also be intimacy related. And then when we're looking at labor, they're not getting the money they need to be able to support their family. So withholding their pay and earnings. They're working long hours for little to no pay. They're being threatened or reported to immigration, and the verbal abuse. They're not getting their medical needs met. When we look at these situations, we look at why isn't that person, it's like, okay, they should know better. They should know that they can get out of this. They don't know. So there's threats of harm to the survivor, their family, and friends. Someone else is controlling the finances, so they can't. They may have had children in the situation. The children, once again, are being controlled. They've seen people punished in front of them, to use as an example, and then once again reinforcing that they've been involved in criminal activities. And as we said specifically before, some of the laws specific to Jamaica are not protecting them from those criminal activities. So now they have that being held over their heads so that trafficker finds something to leverage against that survivor or that victim. So back to, if I've talked about human trafficking, we talked about how widespread it is, we talked about how it's hidden in plain sight. Why can't we find these victims? Well, we have to look at the victim response too. They're denying being a victim. They don't identify as a victim. This has been normalized. They may protect that perpetrator. They may have been in this situation so long that this person is providing them with food, something, a roof over their head, some basic clothing. So if they don't have that, what are they going to have? So they're protecting that perpetrator, or there's someone in that group who's always watching them. someone who's going to report if they say something, reinforcing that next step of being fearful of what may happen to them or fearful what would happen to their family. They fear law enforcement. Looking at some of the stories and statistics, not just in Jamaica and the United States, law enforcement is a contributor to human trafficking. And then fear for safety and privacy. They have these unmet medical conditions, so they may have sexually transmitted infections that are ongoing, or high blood pressure, or lipid problems, or kidney problems. All of these needs are not being met. So when we do finally see them as a healthcare provider, they have many healthcare needs, and it's hard to be able to help in one setting. So reinforcing that it is ongoing, and they may have lifelong health problems. Why don't they leave? Well, some of them have tried to leave, right? But they don't. They get caught. Some of them return willingly to the situation because they got out of the situation and still could not survive once they got out. So they may be isolated. They may be stigmatized. There's that traumatic bondage or Stockholm syndrome where they bond, sympathize, and feel like this is my lover. This is someone who's caring for me. Nobody else is ever taking care of me. I'm going to stick with this person. Threats of exposure. Remember how I said there's people who look just like us, who have high-paying jobs, who are involved in the industry. Someone's holding something over their head, keeping them there. They're staying because they can't be exposed. The threat of violence, and then the debt bondage. That debt bondage is tough because someone is being charged a huge price for something. Okay, so let's say that you got some clothes, or we helped you to escape an area. Well, you owe me this much money. Well, the money never decreases, it only increases, because if you don't have money, you have to eat, you have to live, so they're going to continue to charge. You're going to be used as a sex trafficker or trafficked person. They're going to get the money, and your debt bondage is never paid off. The same thing with labor. The long hours never pay off the debt in regards to what you're doing. And then back to why don't they self-report? Some are truly locked in, guys, but the majority are locked in mentally. So captivity and isolation, yes, some are locked in the homes, some are locked in the rooms, but many of them are physically and are mentally locked in. They're tied to that person, fear of escape. We look at the fear, the shame, the hopelessness, and self-blame because they're traumatized. They may have been told they're nobody and nothing, and they blame themselves for the abuse and feel like they deserve it. They can't see a way out. They've been trained to lie, to protect that person, or once again, they've seen bad things happen to people who try to tell their story. And they have a fear and distrust of service providers and law enforcement. So they can come into a clinic and you can see them, and they still may not admit to what's going on, saying that they are where they want to be instead of they're not, they don't have a choice. And then the dependency, they've bonded, the emotional, physical, and financial dependency. One of the survivors that I had an opportunity to interview, and this was in the United States, not in Jamaica, but the story stays the same. She was trafficked by her mother, and her mother trafficked her, and she was from a huge family. And she's like, I enjoyed that time with my mother. I was okay being trafficked because she gave me that attention. And today, this person still struggles. She doesn't understand who she is. She may have some regrets because there wasn't that follow-up to help her be able to start a new life. So she's like, I don't know who I am. I don't know how to live in this world in which I'm in. This is all I've ever known. So that lets you know the barriers that we have as we start looking at potential survivors and how do we help them once we get them out of this situation. So there's that psychological coercion that increased that likelihood of trauma bonding, and then, that psychological survival. So let's move on to some of the key indicators of what a person may look like. These are people in any country, any state, any environment. No identification or travel documents. You try to see who they are, they don't have anything. They may have unusual bruising, scars, hair pulled out, tattoos or missing teeth, shall I say, black eyes, fractures and dislocation. So it's all unusual. This is the person as myself, as a healthcare provider. This person presented with frequent pregnancies or miscarriages caused by abuse or frequent STIs. So you may have seen this person pregnant over and over again. And instead of thinking, my gosh, don't you use birth control? We got to start looking at what's going on. Maybe there's something going on with this person and they don't have an option to use birth control. When we look at sex trafficking, this person is under the age of 18, no matter what, anyone under the age of 18 in the industry is considered sex trafficking, and also above the age of 18. This person may have tattoos. What we see a lot is people with tattoos that have that trafficker's name so that the trafficker knows who they are. So we may see branding or for sale signs. This person has an unusually high number of sexual partners. They don't have on appropriate clothing for whatever environment or the venue. And they use common language or language that's common to the commercial sex industry. And when we say that, we're talking about streetwalkers, prostitution, language that's common to that population group. With labor trafficking, and labor trafficking is huge in Jamaica also. This person's abused at work, they're threatened with harm, their supervisor, they're not allowed to take breaks, not for food or water. They're working long hours. They're not provided with equipment that's appropriate for the work that they're doing. And they were recruited, as we said previously, for a job they're not doing. They were recruited to be a sitter or recruited to be a nanny, and that's not the job they're doing. So recruited for a different work than he or she is currently doing. They're required to live in the house provided by the employer, so they may live with many people or live in a house where they are constantly having to work. One survivor that I worked with pretty much worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the debt was never getting paid off. They have a debt, that employer or the recruiter, that they can't pay off. Key indicators for children. This is that child who's not going to school, unexplained absences, and then we automatically think back to what we said about the many children in Jamaica who are disappearing or the ones who never returned back to school from the pandemic. We look at a sudden change in what they're wearing, or they are dating someone who's older or abusive. They have these injuries that we talked about or signs of abuse. They now suffer from drug and alcohol abuse. They overall are fearful, they're anxious, they're angry also. They're withdrawn and depressed, paranoid, nervous, never relaxed, maybe branded, and then they have signs of sexual knowledge beyond their years. This is that homeless youth or the one who's chronically trying to run away. So these are our red flags because we're looking at how can we stop some of this human trafficking. We have to look for the red flags. We have to reach out and offer support to that child. We have to be able to call the hotline or the national number that we have in Jamaica, that you have in Jamaica, to contact law enforcement regarding the children that are potentially in this situation. So I spent quite a bit of time giving you an idea of what that trafficking person looks like, how they got there. I want to talk about, okay, if we are able to help someone get out of that trafficking arena, if we're able to help them get out, what's next? Because if they're still homeless, they're probably going to go back to trafficking. If they've been trafficked from infancy, they don't know how to go get a job. They don't know how to go pay bills. They don't know how to go buy food. So we have to get them some life skills. We have to look at advocacy to finding a place to be able to live, a place to be able to learn and to learn life skills and transition to the life beyond trafficking. We look at the records, the criminal records they have. Chances of being able to get a good job are not going to be that good if they have criminal records. How do we get rid of some of those records? Getting legal and law enforcement involved, teaching them how to manage finances so that they can stay above the board. And a huge thing we have to do is look at treating their physical and psychological problems, having ongoing support, as well as the mental health support. Because without any of those, all of those, pretty much, we're setting them up. Even if we were able to help them out of that situation, we're setting them up to return back. So you're thinking, okay, if somebody got out of that, why would they return back? Because it's the only thing they know. Or once they get out, they can't survive. The same factors existed that led them to that situation. So they're still vulnerable. So recidivism or return to human trafficking is high. So we have to identify resources. We have to advocate for resources. We have to look for funding for resources. And then we have to make it ongoing and not just a one time and done, because that's not going to help. So it takes an average of 7 times for a person to leave that situation and to stay out of trafficking. So that takes us to, what do we do next? Start with awareness, reinforcing, yes, that's why we are here today. Me to share my knowledge, and anyone else in the room to share any of their experiences, but become more aware on what's happening around us. And then we want to look at that, see something, do something, report it appropriately. Start community education campaigns like we're doing today, awareness campaigns, and change our way of thinking. We have to stop thinking that that's a bad kid, or that's just a prostitute, or she did it to herself. No one did it to themselves. It's the environment, those social determinants of health, that our environment already set them up to being in this situation, that vulnerability. How do we decrease that vulnerability and increase that education? How do we increase the protection, especially when it's happening right at home? So if we're in imminent danger, guys, we always need to take care of ourselves, or whatever the emergency system is there in Jamaica. But then if there's a suspicion of trafficking, I put the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons. That's specific to Jamaica. That's the last up-to-date information I have. So if anything is different, we will let you guys know. And then in any situation, we have to prepare that survivor, because it's not like, ooh, we heard that, we saw that, let's get you out of here. Have to develop a plan, try to figure out how to get them out of that situation. So there may not be an immediate plan for removal or relocation. We also have to send the right message when we're talking to people. We have to communicate with, open eyes, open ears, not like, oh my gosh, we don't want to be the one crying about what happened to anyone, because I've heard so many stories that we could easily be that person, because the stories are very sad. But we want to communicate with openness so that they feel comfortable. It does not, they're not going to be comfortable immediately. They're not going to trust you. These are all normal things. They've been tricked. So we have to build that trust if it ever is to develop. We invite them to call the hotline that we have listed previously. We want to talk to them about some personal strategies for safety. We want to look for red flags and make sure we're in a safe environment. We want to offer resources and then recognize that there are hotlines available and strategies to combat human trafficking. So that is my human trafficking one-on-one or 101. And I want to definitely, let you guys know that if we ever decide we want to up some and go into more details, we can do that too. But I wanted to have the information so that you walked away with a basic understanding of what human trafficking is, and then be able to answer any questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. E. Thank you very much. So guys, now we'll open the Q&A segment. So if anyone has any questions, they can raise their hands, but we do have a few questions, Dr. E, that were posted in the chat. And the first one that we have here is Mara is asking if does this happen in orphanages or foster homes?
Yes. Unfortunately, our villages and foster homes are hubs for trafficking, because the child is already vulnerable. Now we have them in a room with more vulnerable, more vulnerable children. So sometimes that person is there and targeting these other kids and, putting them out. So they may have even been placed there. So not just in Jamaica, also in the United States, the foster homes are a huge hub for trafficking. I do know in the last couple of years that some of the places in Jamaica have been targeted in regards to that happening. So they're looking at it more closely, but know that it is indeed where it can happen and does happen.
Okay, all right. The next question we have, this is Emma. she was wondering how much money is put into undercover investigations to track human trafficking.
It really does vary. So, and I was looking at some of the statistics in Jamaica. They have a fund specific to some of the undercover task force. But when we look at it at the end of the day, you saw how many people were actually prosecuted. So we have to do more than just the task force. We have to take it all the way. So in regards to Jamaica specifically, they have, once again, a little bit of an improvement from 2022 in regards to tier level, but they're still significantly deficient in regards to protections for their citizens. So when we look at Jamaican money, I think I would actually have to look again to see specifically, but they do have some funds for it. But money is limited, and it's limited in the United States also. So know that we have the same problem here. Specifically Tampa, I'm in Tampa, Florida. We have trafficking that we're a big hub. We're number 3 in the United States for human trafficking. And so there's money delegated to it, but is it really making a difference? Yes, but we don't have the resources and we don't have enough funding. So we have to advocate for more funding.
All right.
And then when we do our sting, what do we do with our person? If we don't have housing, okay, we did this sting. We got this person out of trafficking. Where are they going to go? We don't have housing. We don't have funding. We don't have resources.
Yeah. Okay, all right, so one more from the chat, and I see we have Anne with her hand raised. This is coming from Emma again. Are the parents able to give any information about the kids missing in Jamaica? Are they actually runaways?
That was a task force that went door to door. So boots on the ground, Jamaica definitely sent some social workers out, and as well as youths, to try to find them. They did not specifically say what family members said regarding the children. If the family members were aware, I'm sure they identified them as runaways. But they may just be didn't come home. That does happen. Some of them were ones that they thought they were sending and still hopefully think that they sent somewhere to be able to live somewhere else and have a better life, and maybe not have heard from them since then. So those are all things that are happening.
All right, thanks, Dr. E. Anne, you may go ahead with your question or comment.
Okay, good night. I just wanted to ask a quick question based on a few things I picked up, kind of hit my head. What's the likelihood of a minor being trafficked when traveling with a quote unquote trusted air hostess back and forth?
So we don't have statistics associated with it, but a very high likelihood. So it's important to really try to vet who the person is that's bringing that person over, someone that you know and you trust, not someone who contacted you. And then really have some things on both sides, so that once they reach that destination, they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, because they may be afraid to tell you what's really going on that other side. They maybe have been told that, someone's going to kill you, someone's going to hurt you, someone's going to burn the house down. So even though we think they're in a safe environment, they still may not be, based on that. So high incidence of that happening. And, once again, United States is a huge hub also.
All right, a question in the chat, Dr. E. So Linville says, there's a trend where teenagers to 25 years old are knowingly going overseas on overseas trips for a hookup and get caught in this trap. Is there any data to support this trend? And the second part is there anything being done to curtail this trend that you may know of?
Education. Education is our biggest thing, awareness and education. So first, us identifying that, this is indeed happening, because now we can at least start talking to the kids saying, hey, this fast money is not going to be so fast. And it still is not that easy, guys. I was recently a part of a sting myself, and it was the first one. And I was on the other side to be able to greet some of the victims that were brought over, from the place where they were being trafficked from. And one of the girls, only one, admitted to being trafficked out of the number 20 something that came over. And the other ones identified as, I need to make this money. I need to send it home, or I need to, I don't have a choice. I don't have any other way to live here. So they don't realize that they do have options. or, you know, there's somebody there making sure of what they're, you know, verifying what they're saying is appropriate. So we are trying to do it with education. We all know the young kids, they know everything. And that's happening here in the United States also. 1 in 7 children runaways, majority of them being victims of human trafficking. Hard to locate, hard to get out of the field.
Okay. All right. So Dr. E, I have a question. With the children being online, and I know you touched on it a little, where I know many parents give the children the tablets or the devices to keep them occupied. What are some of the things that parents or guardians can do to, I guess I want to say, mitigate or reduce the likelihood of them having conversations with unscrupulous persons or these trafficking persons?
That's a great question, Lynette. And I can tell you that the survivors that I come in contact with, their kids don't have devices that they can take in their room. Their devices are only used in public spaces. And I actually was lucky enough to be able to do a research project about a year or so ago that involved over 30 survivors of human trafficking. And, you know, life is hard. It is hard trying to reintegrate back into the community. So they stay away from the social media. They don't let their kids have the social media. Granted, we all know that the kids are going to go to their friend's house and get the social media. So that's what I try to tell the friends that I have that are survivors. You know, these kids are still going to go to their friend's house and get on their social media. So really education, trying to increase awareness. I had another friend whose child was actually targeted by somebody on social media. Once that person gets in that kid's brain, and she was only 10, once they're in that kid's brain and telling them how beautiful they are and how great they are and all the things they can do and how they can save them from their terrible parents, it's hard to get those kids back. So if we can start early, it's going to be key to the process. So if we can get it in school, education in the school regarding what this is and how to avoid going down those rabbit holes, that's a great environment. Because at home, some of those are the traffickers. So they're not going to get it at home. So obviously in the home environment also, but we got to get in the churches. We got to get in the schools. We got to look in the community on how we can get the education to these kids to try to stop some of it.
Wow, wow. Thanks, Dr. E. Thanks. And I believe those are the questions for now.
Good night.
Oh, you had your hand raised?
No, I didn't. I'm driving. That's why.
Okay, go ahead.
Good evening. Very, very good presentation. Very informative. But I have a question. What are some of the signs and even symptoms that we can look for individuals who are being targeted for child trafficking, because their behavior would change? But what is it that we are to look for to say, okay, then this may be a probability, and how to reach out for help?
Mm-hmm. So some of the things we typically see, and that's a great question, is suddenly a change in attitude, and not just associated with now you're 13 and a change in attitude, but suddenly a change in attitude in regards to how that child is acting. Are they bringing home things? Like what we see here is that person's bringing home this purse. This one girl was being targeted at the mall. This guy was convincing her to come to the mall and get a purse every week or so, but she had to exchange sex acts for it. She brought her friend along. So who are they hanging out with? Because they're pretty much bringing their friends into the trade also. So a change in what they're wearing, even if it's in their book bag, kind of look in the book bag and seeing what they're wearing once they're getting out of the house. Are they wearing clothes that's more promiscuous, not appropriate for the age, which is hard today because kids wear everything, but looking at that. And then the language, start listening to what they're saying. If you're that mom who's the driver, listen to what's going on in the car. I've heard some great stories being the driver of my kids and what's going on. Like who had sex in the hall and somebody videoed it and now you guys are putting it everywhere. So you can hear a lot. So starting to listen in those small groups. But you really start to see a change in attitude. You see a change in how they dress. You see a change in them bringing things home or trying to hide things, and sneaking off, not where they're supposed to be. Monitoring that social media is key. I am also, as Lisa said, I'm a sexual assault nurse examiner. So many victims of rape are meeting somebody on social media, someone who appeared nice, and it's not a nice person. So that's that segue into this life, because now their self-esteem is low, putting themselves at risk, and they don't know.
Wow, well, all right, thanks for that, Dr. E. If I should have one takeaway, well, a light bulb that went off in my head when you went more into the behavior of the children and how these traffickers encourage them. What I heard, not said, but what I heard in my head was develop a relationship with your child, because then there's no one to save them from this horrible home life that they have, or to get away from the monster who is, the mother or the father. Not talking about the ones who are actually abusing the children or trafficking them, but just not having that bond with your child for whatever reason. So developing a relationship with your child, or a good relationship, is also, I guess we could say, one of the preventative techniques or things that we could do.
Yes, and know that, social services are trying, and the resources are trying, they're just scarce, so we don't want to be like, okay, we don't want to pull them out and get them into foster care because this bad thing might happen. Yes, that might happen, but we have to at least, not leave them in that situation. Look and see what's in the community, find some potential resources, and being able to help. One of the organizations that I volunteer with is Shared Hope International, and I know that they have some resources in the Jamaica community where they've helped to establish a home for children who have been trafficked. So know that there's some great resources out there, and that help is out there. We just got to get more of it.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. E. Thank you very much. And now I am going to ask Jody Ann Carr to take the floor.
Hi, good night, everyone. Able to hear me well?
Yes, I'm hearing you clearly.
Okay, perfect. So, Dr. E, I want, on behalf of Love of Hearts Foundation, 5F Ministries, and everybody that is here, I really want to express our heartfelt gratitude for this session. It was very enlightening, very informative. You delved into several topics, very important topics, looking at the childhood experiences, looking at the risk factors, and just some of the barriers that exist. And of course, this is just the somewhat of the tip of the iceberg. It's so much more comprehensive, and there's so much more that we can discuss, but this is a great foundation for persons to just keep learning more. So thank you so much for shedding light on the complexities of what human trafficking is and the challenges that it's faced in combating human trafficking. As someone that has done some work in this space, I'm very grateful for your willingness to keep advocating, keep educating, your passion, your advocacy, your knowledge, your community engagement. It's truly commendable. Human trafficking is a global issue, and really it can be very difficult to resolve if persons are unaware. So I'm happy that for everyone that turned out here today, because all of us have a role to play in this fight. What stood out for me is your emphasis on not making any judgments and challenging our perspectives, and just taking the time to understand the complexities of human trafficking, because it's not as black and white as some persons may think it is. So I really want to just tell you thank you again. Thank you to everyone that came. Your presence really shows a genuine desire to just know more and to make a difference. And thank you, Dr. E, for highlighting the importance of understanding better what human trafficking is, understanding the importance of empathy, and what is necessary to begin addressing this issue. So thank you again, and I'll hand back over to Lenny.
Thank you so much, Jody. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. All right, so thanks everyone for coming on. All right, so thanks again everyone for jumping on. When the meeting ends, there's going to be a quick survey. I believe it's just 10 questions, but it's just click buttons, because we we want feedback and we want to know what can be done differently, how the presentation can be improved, etc. And as Dr. E said, this was just the tip of the iceberg. It was human trafficking 101, right? And if we do need to delve in more, she's able to do that for us. And we thank you from 5F Ministries, again, Love of Hearts Foundation that we partnered with, and Dr. Eve representing Free Network to bring us this presentation on human trafficking awareness. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good night.